Not everyone is meant for elegant places. That's what he said when she spilled champagne on his sleeve. The room laughed. She didn't. She walked away in silence, straight into the grind that would one day make her Dr. Tatum Lewis. Years later, when he woke up broken and bloodied after an accident, the surgeon leading his operation was the same woman he once humiliated. Her scalpel was steady, her grace sharper. Stay with us. What begins as heartbreak often ends in power, because every woman they tried to silence carries a story the world needs to hear. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever rewritten your own story, turned pain into purpose, or doubt into drive? Share your moment of strength in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Black Stories Untold with love, and ring that notification bell for more powerful stories that celebrate resilience, grace, and the beauty of rising anyway. The chandeliers above the ballroom glowed like constellations suspended in gold. Every surface shimmered, every glass reflected wealth. Alan Wilson moved through the crowd as if the air itself parted for him. 42 years old, self-made and proud of it, he wore confidence like a second skin. Laughter followed him wherever he went. His company had just crossed $1 billion in value, and people leaned in when he spoke, hungry for proximity to success. At his table sat venture capitalists, models, and actors pretending not to be impressed. Alan raised his glass, ready to deliver another story about winning when everyone else doubted him. That's when it happened. A young server turned too quickly. A tray tilted. Chilled champagne splashed across his custom-made suit. For a heartbeat, the music seemed to stop. The young woman froze, her eyes wide. Her skin glowed with the warm depth of polished mahogany. A loose curl slipped from her bun as she tried to steady the tray. She whispered an apology, her voice trembling before finding its footing. Her name tag caught the light. Tatum. Alan looked down at his soaked sleeve, then up at her. His jaw tightened. The men beside him snickered. One muttered something about how money couldn't buy grace. Alan smiled, but it was sharp. He turned to the table, projecting his voice just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Not everyone is meant for elegant places. The laughter that followed was cruel, echoing louder than the orchestra. Tatum's cheeks flushed, but her eyes didn't drop. She straightened her shoulders, placed the empty tray on a nearby stand, and offered a final, calm apology before walking away with her head high. For a moment, Alan almost felt something like regret, but ego quickly pushed it aside. He ordered another drink. The night moved on. Jokes, applause, the hollow sound of people pretending to admire each other. Later, in his penthouse overlooking the city, Alan retold the story to friends gathered around a glass table filled with imported whiskey. He called it a lesson in humility, laughing as if cruelty were wit. The others laughed too, though their laughter carried the uneasy tone of people who knew the joke had gone too far. When the laughter faded and the music from downstairs dissolved into the city's hum, Alan poured himself another drink. The skyline blinked silver and gold outside his window. Success felt heavy tonight, heavier than usual. He stared at his reflection in the glass, the spot on his cuff still faintly damp. Somewhere below that glittering skyline, Tatum Lewis sat in a small apartment, scrubbing champagne stains from her uniform before returning to her textbooks. She replayed the laughter in her head, the sting of it, the way it cut sharper than any scalpel she'd ever held. But beneath the ache burned something fierce. She promised herself that one day she would walk into rooms like that, not as the help, but as the authority. She would rise on her own terms. And the next time life placed her face to face with a man like Alan Wilson, it would be her voice giving orders while he listened. The city never sleeps, but that night 2 lives turned quietly in opposite directions. one deeper into arrogance, the other toward destiny. The hum of the subway faded as Tatum climbed the cracked steps to her apartment. The night air carried the smell of rain and fried food from the street below. Her body ached from a double shift, but it was the echo of laughter from that ballroom that kept her chest tight. Inside, the apartment was small but warm. A thrift store lamp flickered beside her desk, illuminating open textbooks covered in notes. On the wall hung a framed photo of her mother, smiling wide, the corners worn from years of being touched. Tatum dropped her bag and sat at her desk. She pressed her palms against her eyes. The exhaustion felt bone deep. Her scrubs still smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. She reached for a notebook and began reviewing anatomy charts, whispering terms under her breath. Between the hum of the radiator and the scratching of her pen, the city outside sounded like a heartbeat pushing her forward. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Marion Reeves. "Just checking on you, kid. Proud of you for pushing through." Tatum smiled faintly. Dr. Reeves had been her attending physician during her first hospital rotation, a woman of quiet authority whose voice could steady a storm. She had seen Tatum's strength long before Tatum saw it herself. At the hospital the next morning, the fluorescent lights felt merciless. Tatum followed Dr. Reeves through the hallways, taking notes during rounds. Between patients, Dr. Reeves handed her a cup of stale coffee and studied her face. "You look tired," she said softly. Tatum shrugged. "Tired is better than defeated." Dr. Reeves nodded, her eyes kind but sharp. "Remember, brilliance doesn't bloom in comfort. It grows in the cracks, in the places that hurt." Tatum carried those words with her through the long day that followed. During her lunch break, she sat alone in the cafeteria, scrolling through scholarship applications on her phone. Each required essays, transcripts, and recommendation letters she hadn't had time to request. Still, she filled them out one by one, her handwriting cramped and determined. Every rejection she had ever received replayed in her mind like a chorus meant to keep her small. But she refused to stay small. That night, back in her apartment, she heated leftover noodles on the stove and opened another textbook. The clock ticked toward midnight. Her eyelids grew heavy, but she kept reading until the words blurred. Her mother's voice whispered in memory, telling her she was meant for more. Tatum looked at the photo again. Her mother had worked 3 jobs and still found time to smile like the world hadn't tried to break her. That strength lived in her daughter now. Tatum picked up her pen and wrote on a scrap of paper, a promise to herself. "One day, I will stand in the room where power lives, and no one will laugh." She taped the paper above her desk. It fluttered slightly with each breeze from the window. Outside, Harlem buzzed with life, sirens mixing with laughter, engines, and music. Inside, a young woman straightened her back and turned another page. Her hands were tired, her eyes burned, but her resolve was sharp as glass. Tatum Lewis was no longer the woman who had walked out of that gala in silence. She was becoming someone else entirely, someone who would never bow again. The city that once moved to Alan Wilson's rhythm began to turn against him. First came the whispers, then the headlines. A risky investment he had promised would double fortunes devoured them instead. Stockholders demanded answers. Reporters circled like vultures. Overnight, the man toasted as a genius became a symbol of arrogance. His face filled screens, his name printed beside words like scandal and collapse. He spent his days in boardrooms where silence replaced applause. Associates who once laughed at his jokes now avoided his gaze. The charm that had opened every door no longer worked. His voice carried desperation instead of power. He threw money at the problem, calling in favors no longer owed. The more he tried to control the narrative, the more it slipped through his fingers. At night, the penthouse that had felt like a throne began to echo. He wandered through its glass walls, surrounded by trophies of a life that suddenly felt hollow. Half-empty glasses of scotch lined his counter. Messages from his lawyer went unanswered. He told himself it was only a bad quarter, a temporary dip, a storm a man like him could outlast. But inside, fear gnawed at the arrogance he wore like armor. One rainy evening, Alan got into his car after a board meeting that had ended in shouting and threats. The city lights blurred behind the windshield. He drove too fast, too angry to care. The radio hummed softly, some song about redemption. He laughed bitterly at the irony. He thought of every person he had dismissed, every hand he had brushed aside on his climb to the top. The thought barely formed before the world exploded in white. Tires screeched, glass shattered, metal folded around him. Then stillness. The airbag deflated with a hiss. The smell of smoke filled his lungs. Pain flared through his chest, sharp and spreading. He tried to move, but his hands were slick with blood. Through the cracked window, he saw his own reflection in the shards. Pale and dazed, the mask of control finally stripped away. Sirens grew louder, echoing through the rain. Paramedics pulled him from the wreckage, their voices firm and distant. He caught glimpses of bright lights, blue uniforms, the inside of an ambulance shaking with every turn. For the first time in his life, no amount of money could command the moment. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and cold, like a warning. Alan tried to open his eyes, but the world swayed in slow motion. Bright lights burned above him. Voices moved around him in quick rhythm, firm and urgent. Panic rose in his chest as the memory flickered, screeching tires, shattered glass. Then came the sound that cut through everything. A calm, steady voice giving orders with precision that left no space for fear. Scalpel. Even through the haze of pain and medication, something in that voice struck him. He tried to focus, tried to see her. A shadow leaned over him, masked, gloved, composed. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Dark, focused, unshakable. Then he remembered. The charity gala. The champagne, the laughter. The woman who had stood tall while he made her small. Tatum Lewis. Alan wanted to speak, to apologize, to say anything. But the anesthesia pulled him under before he could form a single word. Hours passed. The operating room held the quiet music of machines and soft conversation, broken only by Tatum's instructions. Her team moved like a symphony. Steady hands, steady breath. Each motion was measured, her presence the center of gravity. She had seen every kind of wound before, but this one felt different. The man on the table wasn't just another patient. He was a mirror of the arrogance she had once faced. And yet, as she stitched torn flesh and repaired what recklessness had broken, there was no anger in her hands, only purpose. In moments of stillness between beeping monitors, she watched the faint rise and fall of his chest. She thought of the vow she had made in her apartment years ago, the one she wrote above her desk. One day she would stand in the room where power lived and no one would laugh. The irony wasn't lost on her now. Power wasn't in status or money or pride. It was in control, in grace, in choosing to do what was right when no one was watching. By the time the surgery ended, dawn had crept into the windows of the trauma wing. The city was waking again, unaware that a life had just been pieced back together by the same hands once dismissed at a gala table. Tatum stepped out of the operating room, her scrubs streaked with effort, her heartbeat steady. Nurses congratulated her, but she only nodded. What she felt wasn't victory. It was balance. Later, as Alan was wheeled into recovery, still unconscious, she paused at the doorway. The man who had once spoken to her like she was invisible now lay helpless, alive because of her. She looked at him not with satisfaction, but with something quieter, clarity. She had crossed a line he would never understand. from wounded to whole, from forgotten to indispensable. She turned and walked down the corridor, the echo of her footsteps fading behind her. The world had shifted again, not with applause or revenge, but with the quiet power of mercy. The days blurred together in a haze of antiseptic and half-sleep. Machines hummed softly beside Alan's bed, steady where his thoughts were not. The first few mornings, he tried to charm the nurses, the old habit rising like muscle memory. He made jokes about the food, about the gowns, about how the world must be missing him. Some smiled politely, others didn't bother. Beneath his rehearsed grin, shame began to take root, silent but persistent. When he finally sat up without pain tearing through him, the nurse handed him his discharge papers. The name printed at the bottom made his breath catch. Dr. Tatum Lewis. The letters stared back at him, crisp and unflinching. The same name he had once mocked, now the signature that kept his heart beating. His chest tightened. He asked if he could thank her in person, but the nurse told him she was in surgery. He nodded, but his mind wouldn't let go. That night, sleep refused him. The room was dim, the city's glow creeping through the blinds like an unwelcome memory. He stared at the ceiling, hearing again that calm voice he had heard before the darkness took him. He remembered her eyes, steady, focused, unafraid. A woman he had laughed at, commanding the world around him while he lay helpless. The thought made him shift uncomfortably. He had spent a lifetime being the one in control, the one who decided who mattered. Now the balance had changed, and the taste of humility was bitter. He pressed the call button, and a young nurse appeared. She asked if he was in pain. He hesitated before answering. Not the kind she could treat. Instead, he asked how long Dr. Lewis had been working there. The nurse smiled faintly, as if she had heard the question before. Everyone knew her story, she said. How she had grown up in Harlem, lost her mother young, and worked through every obstacle to reach Harvard Medical School. No shortcuts, no powerful last name, just grit and sleepless nights, the kind of story that people like him loved to post about but never truly understood. When she left, the silence returned, but it no longer felt empty. It felt accusing. He thought about the ballroom, the laughter, the way she had looked at him when the champagne had soaked his sleeve. He had told that story for years, made it a joke at dinners. Now it made him sick. The nurse's words echoed in his head, each one peeling away another layer of his old pride. Morning came slowly, soft light spilling across the room. Alan turned his head toward the window. Outside, people hurried to work, chasing the same illusion he once worshipped. He realized he didn't want it anymore. Power, respect, wealth. None of it mattered beside the quiet strength of the woman who had saved him without hesitation. He closed his eyes and let the truth settle, heavy but cleansing. Somewhere in the same building, Tatum Lewis was likely saving another life, moving forward without knowing that the man she had once humbled was finally learning what it meant to bow. The day Alan saw her again, the air in his hospital room shifted. The steady rhythm of machines, the muted footsteps in the hallway, even the light itself seemed to hold its breath. Weeks of recovery had dulled his body but sharpened his mind. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say 100 times, but as the door opened and she stepped in, the words scattered. Tatum Lewis stood at the foot of his bed, the same calm presence he remembered from the blur of surgery. Her posture was straight, her eyes unreadable, her white coat spotless. Everything about her radiated control. Alan, pale and weak against the pillows, looked at her as if she carried something sacred. He wanted to speak, but shame pressed against his throat. Tatum broke the silence first, her voice even and quiet. She asked how he was healing, checked the monitor, made a few notes on his chart. Every motion was precise, deliberate. He noticed how steady her hands were, The same hands that had saved him. The same hands he had once embarrassed. He tried to thank her, to say something that might undo what he had done years ago, but the words felt small. She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since that night. "You don't have to thank me," she said simply. "Saving lives is my job, even yours." Her tone was professional, almost detached, but something behind her calmness flickered. Alan could feel it. The memory between them hung in the space like smoke. His arrogance, her humiliation, the long silence that followed. He wanted to tell her how much he regretted it, how the moment had replayed in his mind every night since he woke up. Instead, he said only that he wished he could take it back. Tatum's pen paused mid-note. She didn't look at him, not right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, steadier. "People think an apology is enough," she said. "But forgiveness isn't something you ask for, it's something you earn." Her words cut through him with more precision than any scalpel. He nodded, unable to argue. She finished her notes and placed the chart back on the bed. For a second, she seemed ready to leave, then she hesitated. There was a storm behind her eyes, restrained but fierce. It wasn't revenge she felt. It was the weight of seeing him helpless after the years she had spent building herself from nothing. She had thought the moment might bring satisfaction. Instead, it brought something heavier, clarity. Alan watched her turn toward the door. Her presence filled the room even as she walked away. He wanted to stop her, to say that he didn't expect forgiveness, only the chance to become someone worthy of it. But she didn't look back. When the door closed, he stared at the space she had left behind. Her words echoed in his mind long after she was gone. Forgiveness isn't something you ask for, it's something you earn. He realized then that he had been given not absolution, but a mirror, and for the first time he didn't look away. The city looked different to Alan now. The same skyline that once glittered with promise now seemed quieter, smaller, stripped of its illusion of control. Freedom felt strange after weeks in recovery. His body healed faster than his pride, though both carried scars. He walked slower, thought longer, spoke less. The silence in him was not empty, it was searching. He returned to his penthouse, the same glass fortress that had once made him feel untouchable. Dust clung to untouched furniture, the air heavy with absence. The first thing he did was open the curtains. The second was pick up the phone. The call was short, direct, and private. He wanted to make a donation, no recognition, no photo, no press. The money would fund scholarships for underrepresented medical students, a lifeline for those who reminded him of the woman who had saved him. He refused to let his name appear anywhere near it. The gesture wasn't for redemption, it was for balance. Therapy followed next. He sat in rooms that stripped away charm and status, where he was no longer the man with the answers. The therapist asked questions he couldn't hide from. What did success mean before the accident? What does it mean now? At first, his replies were rehearsed. Eventually, they became raw. He learned how to listen to others and to the parts of himself he had silenced for years. Volunteering came quietly. At first, he served coffee at shelters, uncomfortable in his anonymity. Over time, he started mentoring young entrepreneurs, guiding them not toward wealth, but toward worth. The world that once revolved around him now existed beside him, and for the first time, that felt right. At the hospital, life moved on. Tatum's days were long, her nights longer. She trained new interns with the same sharpness that had carried her through her own battles. They admired her precision but feared her distance. She didn't let anyone close, not even those who tried. Strength had become her shield. Her students whispered about her story, the rumors of where she came from, how she had fought her way up from nothing. She never confirmed them. She simply worked. One afternoon, during a rare lunch break, her colleague handed her a newspaper. On the front page was an article about a major anonymous donation to the hospital's minority scholarship fund. The amount made her blink. The journalist had uncovered the source despite the secrecy. Alan Wilson, the same man who had once mocked her, now quietly funding the dreams of others like her. For a moment, she didn't move. The cafeteria buzzed around her, but her mind went still. It wasn't the money that shook her. It was what the gesture meant: humility, awareness, change without applause. That evening, she walked past the scholarship wall in the hospital lobby. A new plaque had been added, listing the program's name, not its donor. She touched the metal softly, then looked up at her reflection in the glass. The storm inside her eased, just slightly. Grace, she realized, wasn't about forgetting what was done. It was about seeing who someone became afterward. And though she would never say it aloud, a quiet part of her hoped he kept going, not to prove anything to her, but to himself. The hospital smelled of polished floors and tension. Alan had not been back since his discharge, but now he stood in the same lobby with a heaviness that went beyond fear. His mother lay upstairs, waiting for surgery. The woman who had always spoken in absolutes, who believed money could solve anything, was suddenly fragile, her voice quiet when she called his name. Doctors had explained the severity of her condition, but it wasn't until he saw the chart that panic truly hit him. When the nurse mentioned the name of the lead surgeon, the breath left his body. Dr. Tatum Lewis. The room tilted for a moment as the words sank in. He demanded to see another doctor, said there must be someone else qualified. The nurse looked at him evenly, explaining that Dr. Lewis was the best in the department, the best in the city. His protest caught in his throat when he saw his mother watching him from the bed, her expression calm but resolute. "If she saved you, she can save me," she said softly. Alan looked away, ashamed. His mother, who once dismissed people like Tatum as outsiders, now placed her life in her hands without hesitation. He nodded, though the fear in him refused to quiet. Hours passed before the surgery began. Tatum entered the operating room with the same composed authority she always carried. The team moved with precision, trusting her every word. Outside the observation window, Alan stood in silence, his hands pressed against the glass. Every movement she made seemed effortless, her commands confident, her focus unshakable. The sound of her voice reached him faintly through the intercom, measured, steady, certain. He remembered the way she had looked at him during his own recovery, how she had spoken of forgiveness as something earned. Watching her now, he understood the weight behind those words. This was what strength looked like, not the kind he once flaunted at parties or in boardrooms, but the quiet kind that built lives, saved them, carried them. The hours stretched endlessly. Nurses came and went. The clock ticked toward midnight. Alan never left his place by the window. He didn't care about time, about business calls or headlines. He cared only about the woman lying on that table and the one leading the team that could save her. Finally, the doors opened. Tatum stepped out, her gloves removed, her face calm. She saw him before he could speak. "The surgery went well," she said simply. His mother was stable and would recover fully. Relief flooded him, stronger than gratitude, deeper than pride. For a moment they stood there, neither speaking. The hum of the hospital filled the silence between them. He wanted to thank her again, but the words seemed small compared to what she had done. She gave a brief nod, almost imperceptible, then turned back toward her team. As she disappeared down the corridor, Alan looked through the glass one last time. His mother rested peacefully, her heartbeat steady on the monitor. And in that moment, he understood something he had never known before. Power wasn't about being seen, it was about doing good when no one was watching. The rain fell in a slow rhythm, soft enough to blur the edges of the courtyard lights. The world seemed quieter out here, tucked behind the hospital's concrete walls, the hum of the city fading into a distant whisper. Tatum sat on a bench beneath the overhang, her surgical scrub still damp from the long night. The adrenaline of the operation had faded, leaving only the quiet satisfaction that came when a life was saved. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of rain and earth, letting herself exhale. Footsteps broke the silence. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Alan stopped a few feet away, hesitant, as if unsure whether he was welcome. The last time she had seen him, he had been all gratitude and silence. Now, his expression carried something different, something stripped of performance. He stood there for a long moment before speaking. His voice was low, almost careful. He said that the surgery had gone perfectly, that the doctors had told him his mother would recover. Then, after a pause, he admitted what he had really come to say. Her strength, he said, had changed his life more than any fortune he had ever made. He looked at her as though seeing her clearly for the first time, not as the woman he once humiliated, not as the surgeon who had saved him, but as the person whose grace had reshaped his understanding of power. Tatum didn't answer right away. The rain pattered softly against the roof, sliding down in delicate lines. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but it carried a quiet force that filled the space between them. She said she hadn't saved him to prove anything or to teach him a lesson. She saved him because that was what real power looked like, doing what was right, even when no one deserved it. Alan's gaze dropped to the ground. The words hit with more weight than any reprimand. He realized how different her kind of strength was from the one he had spent his life chasing. His version had been loud, demanding, built on admiration. Hers was silent and steady, built on conviction. For a long time, neither spoke. The rain grew heavier, tapping against the metal bench, pooling in the cracks of the pavement. Alan finally stepped forward, close enough for their reflections to blur in the glass of the window beside them. He thanked her, not for saving his mother, not for saving him, but for showing him what dignity looked like when the world tried to take it away. Tatum looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see the man from the gala. She saw a human being stripped of ego, reaching for something real. The bitterness she had carried for years began to loosen its grip. Not gone, not forgotten, but lighter. They stood in silence as the rain softened again, washing the city clean. For the first time, they saw each other without judgment, without pride, without pain, only truth. In that moment, forgiveness stopped being a word and became something simpler. Understanding. The auditorium lights were warm and golden, reflecting off polished floors and fresh paint. The hospital had never looked so alive. Banners hung across the stage, displaying the name of a new program that would shape countless futures, the Lewis Wilson Fellowship. Rows of students filled the seats, some still in their white coats, others clutching notebooks like lifelines. At the front stood two people who had once shared nothing but a painful history. Now they stood side by side. Alan adjusted his tie, feeling the unfamiliar weight of humility instead of pride. The applause wasn't for him this time, and that was exactly how he wanted it. When the program director finished speaking, he turned the microphone toward them. First, Dr. Tatum Lewis. She stepped forward, the lights catching the calm determination in her eyes. Her voice carried through the room with quiet command. She spoke about opportunity, about what it meant to rise when the world expected you to stay down. She told the young doctors that brilliance was not born from privilege but from persistence, from doing the work no one sees. Her words landed with a gravity that came only from experience. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Alan followed, offering a few short words of his own. He spoke not about business or wealth, but about redemption, the kind that comes from facing yourself and choosing differently. He didn't mention her name beyond the title of the program, but every syllable carried her influence. He looked at her as he spoke, gratitude threaded through every breath. When the cameras flashed, Tatum turned slightly toward him. There was no resentment in her expression, only a quiet pride. In that moment, they weren't the woman who had been humiliated and the man who had done the humiliating. They were simply two people who had walked through fire and come out changed. After the ceremony, as the crowd thinned and students gathered around her for photos and advice, Tatum excused herself and slipped away to the place she belonged most, the operating room. The air inside was cool and still, the rhythmic hum of machines steadying her thoughts. A group of new surgeons waited for her instructions, nervous and eager. She tied her mask, her tone calm and confident as she began. Every motion was second nature, every word deliberate. Her gaze moved over the young faces watching her, and she felt the same purpose she had carried since the night she made a promise to herself in that small Harlem apartment. She picked up the first instrument, looked at the student beside her, and spoke the words that had defined her journey. Lead with compassion, even when they don't. Outside the room, Alan stood unseen for a moment, watching through the observation window. Her voice carried softly through the glass, steady as ever. He smiled, knowing she didn't need acknowledgement to matter. She had become something far greater than his apology, a symbol of what grace truly is. As the operation began, the world beyond the glass faded. All that remained was purpose, precision, and peace. The woman he once mocked had rewritten what power meant, and she had done it not with revenge, but with grace. Before you scroll away, remember this: every person who's ever been dismissed, underestimated, or overlooked carries the power to rise higher than anyone imagined. Maybe you've lived that truth. Maybe someone you love needs to. Share this story, not for the applause, but for the woman still fighting to be seen. Let her know her story isn't over yet. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.